Federal Reserve is retiring the word transitory from the phrase transitory inflation. Is the new Jay Powell the old Jay Powell? Is the hawk back? For all this and more, I catch up with ex-Federal Reserve Advisor Danielle DiMartino Booth, who's also the CEO of Quill Intelligence. And remember, if you want to see more interviews with thought leaders and industry experts in financial markets, subscribe to GoldCore TV and hit the notification bell now. And if you want to learn more about how to buy, sell, and store physical gold and silver, log on to goldcore.com, your precious metals experts. Danielle DiMartino Booth, welcome to GoldCore TV.
It's great. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here halfway around the world. Good to see you.
Now, you've said over the last couple of weeks, Jay Powell's new job is definitely not going to be the same as his old job. And on Tuesday last, he announced that they're going to be retiring the phrase or the word transitory from the phrase transitory inflation. So kind of signaling a significant move on behalf of the Fed. But have they been asleep at the wheel for the last while?
You know, I'm not sure if the Fed has been asleep at the wheel as much as the Fed has been paralyzed. And right. There's been so much internal brinksmanship. It makes Machiavelli look like a nun in terms of what's been going on inside the Fed. And that's saying something, because I was inside the Fed for 9 years, and I've never seen anything like what's just occurred in terms of the power struggle to get the renomination to obviously the world's most powerful central bank. So I have to ask myself, because of this internal strife, was the Fed paralyzed and really unable to make a move because there was so much dissension among the ranks? Now that they know who their fearless leader is going to be for the next 4 years, and we know that Jay Powell is going to be confirmed by the Senate very handily, now that they know that, are we going to go back to the Jay Powell that preceded the Powell pivot? And I've begun to ask myself that question. We have to remember that Jay Powell is not a PhD in economics, and that he was undersecretary of the U.S. Treasury when the Salomon Brothers scandal broke out. He worked hand in hand with Warren Buffett back in the day. He founded the Industrials Group at the Carlyle. You know, he was big in the private equity world. He's a lawyer, and he's worth $100 million. So he absolutely $100 million plus. We have his exact net worth we don't know, but let's just say that he's not staying there for the pension and healthcare for life that he gets as being a bureaucrat for 4 more years. He genuinely wants to serve his country. And I haven't defended Jay Powell in a long time. In fact, I was the one who founded, and then I had to disband the Jay Powell fan club after the Powell pivot, January the 4th, 2019. And I find myself saying, is this his epiphany moment? Is this his come to Jesus? He's a Republican. Pat Toomey's a Republican. They come from the same part of the country. Pat Toomey, unlike most US politicians, and I hate to get into the weeds here, but it's important. I have a hashtag for him. It's hashtag term limit Toomey, because he believes in term limits. He knows he's leaving office in 2022. He's purposely laid down the line when it comes to other members of Congress being softer. And in the retiring transitory moment, that was prompted by one of Jay Powell's peers, Pat Toomey, again, who's leaving office. And he said, everything is transitory. Life is transitory. And when you have somebody who's your peer look you straight in the eye, and then you say, maybe it's time to retire that world. Maybe that was Jay Powell's, unpivoting. Maybe that was him saying, the Fed has 2 bad choices to make because we've backed ourselves so far into a corner. The Fed has never had an experiment of this magnitude. That I was in Italy and in Paris recently, and there is actual international animosity at the inflation that has been catalyzed by an overly just a fiscal policy gone wild in the United States, 42.3% of GDP injected directly into the checking accounts of Americans. It's going to cause global inflation, and it has. So it's hurting people even outside of US borders. So he knows, and that's on Jay Powell, by the way, because he went along and monetized every penny of that debt. So now we're at a point where either he accelerates the taper and moves on to the business of raising interest rates in order to address the inflation that's staring us in the face, that is clearly not transitory, even though it could dissipate in 2022 in the second half. We're already seeing evidence thereof. But nonetheless, in the here and now, does he continue to ignore the plight of the lowest income earning Americans for whom inflation is the most regressive tax? Or does he take a chance that he's going to take the stock market down? So do we have the pre-2019 Jay Powell, or do we have the post-29 Jay Powell? I think we're about to find out, folks.
There are two horrible choices, basically.
I mean, the correlation of the S&P 500 and CEO confidence in America is 0.7. And that means that if you take the stock market down, there will be ripple effects in the economy. But I think Jay Powell right now is saying that the stakes are so high because the Federal Reserve is mandated to make policy, quote unquote, in the public interest. That's a quote. It's right at the very top of the Federal Reserve Board's webpage. And right now, the policy of monetizing every last debt and injecting all of this liquidity into the stock market is not helping. It's not in the public interest. It's in the interest of the top 1%, but it's certainly not in the public interest. So if he's decided to go back to serving his country, because that's why I worked at the Fed for 9 years, I wanted to serve my country. And I fought the good fight against quantitative easing and unconventional monetary policy. I said that we didn't need to stop at 0%. We needed to stop at 2% to keep the banking market functioning, to keep the modeling going, that 0% would cause all kinds of malinvestment and in the end, boom and bust cycles. I was ignored. Ben Bernanke took it to the zero bound. But it's clearly created problems ever since December the 15th, 2008, because I would argue that the flash recession that followed the pandemic notwithstanding, we've not looked back ever since then, since taking rates to the zero bound, and nothing's been addressed.
So we have two choices, and as you say, middle and lower income families across the US, and effectively, it's not just isolated within the US. It's an inflationary problem that is happening across the globe, and it is hitting the lower. It always hits the lower income individual the hardest.
Right, and winter's coming. Winter's here.
Yes, yeah. Maybe you might speak to just the inflationary problem that you are identifying for those middle and lower income families in the US.
So, you know, I tweeted out last week. I was in the grocery store and I tweeted out that a pound of bacon was $10, and it went viral. I mean, as far as viral can go with me. I mean, I'm no superstar, but it went pretty viral. And I just said, "Dearest Jay, as your first order of business as chair of the Fed in your new position, would you mind addressing the fact that bacon is $10 a pound?"
Yeah.
Americans can literally not bring home the bacon. Sincerely, Americans. And the tweet went nuts. And whether you're at the gas pump or at the grocery store, or whether you're trying to renew a lease and you're finding out that your new rent is nothing like your old rent, it's up 10%. That's 40% of your average US American household's budget. And that's also regressive. Housing and renting as a percentage of their disposable income after tax is higher the lower you go on the income scale. So housing has run amok, and there are people on the Fed who've said those mortgage-backed securities purchases should have stopped a long time ago. They said it publicly, public Fed officials. So you know, it's incumbent upon Jay Powell to pull the plug on housing speculation. I would applaud him on December the 15th, even though it's within 10 days of Christmas, if he said, you know what, we're doing harm to the housing sector, even though we know we're going to expedite the taper. I've said as much in public testimony to Congress. You know what, we're going to go ahead and just exit out of this mortgage-backed securities support, just to potentially provide some relief to the housing sector. It might take home prices down, but that won't be a bad thing for those who are suffering because home prices and the price of renting in America is at a record high.
And if we
So
do
that's
see,
kind of the prism you're looking through if you're the lowest income earner.
yeah, and if you do see that, if you do see them moving up the taper, increasing it and bringing it closer as well, you're going to see a fairly sharp reaction in stocks as well, though, aren't you?
Well, I mean, you would think so. The market is also heavily influenced, specifically in the United States, to a greater extent by the forces of passive investing. And I've been writing a lot about passive investing for my research company, Quill Intelligence, because of a phenomena that is unique to US 401k plans, which the bulk of working Americans, that's how they save for retirement. So call it 5 to 10% of US paychecks every other week are being funneled into retirement plans that in 2006, the law changed requiring these plans be appropriate. These plans be designed in such a way that if your worker is 30 years old, these target date funds that the government requires to be in 401k plans, unless somebody opts in to do something more active as an employee. But most employees who are young, they don't know what to do when it comes to investing. So they'll take the advice of the Human Resources Department. So they'll go into one of these target date funds. And if you're a 30-year-old worker, as I was saying, that means that 30% of your portfolio more or less will be in bonds, 70% of your portfolio more or less will be in stocks. So again, why am I in these weeds? March the 23rd, 2020. It was a watershed day on the global financial scene. The Federal Reserve opened both barrels. They bailed out the corporate bond market, didn't buy very many bonds, but they said they would if they needed to. And they launched QE, the likes of which we've never seen. And they basically got married to the US Treasury Department, which is against the law, in order to have off-balance sheet vehicles that could accept securities that the Fed is not legally able to hold. That's March the 23rd, 2020. Everybody's like, wow, the Fed came riding to the rescue. And on top of that, target date funds had to do their quarterly rebalancing on March the 23rd. So if you're Joe Q worker in the United States of America and you're 30 years old and the value of the 70% of your portfolio has been decimated between February the 19th and March the 23rd of 2020, when you were spending your afternoons over the pond watching the US markets open to circuit breakers, clipping off 1,000 points at a time. So if you're in a 30-20, then you have to automatically, there's no human beings involved in these indexing funds. You have to automatically rebalance your equity holdings back up to 70% and take your bond holdings down to 30%. So just to give you an example, the largest one of these automated funds is Vanguard's Total Index Stock Market Fund. It feeds more US 401ks than any one particular ETF in the country. It's worth $1.3 trillion. Wow. That one fund. But this was nationwide, March 23rd, 2020, this massive rebalancing. So even though you think that the Fed taper being expedited should upset markets going forward, and it will have a disturbing force because markets live and die on liquidity, you could still have a moment at the end of the year when target date funds in America have to rebalance around Christmas. And people never noticed that before the Powell pivot, and again, I'm being very specific here, but your interview is going to go viral, by the way, because I've never actually walked this through with anybody. But before the Powell pivot of January the 4th, 2019, when he said, when I was a rookie on the Fed and I was critical of quantitative easing, I was young and naive. I didn't mean to take the pictures and be nude. And he apologized with Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke on stage. I got condolence cards. I didn't stop crying for 24 hours and I had to disband the Jay Powell fan club. But that was January the 4th. Markets started to rebound the minute they reopened after the Christmas Eve bloodbath of 2018. Why is that? It's because these target date funds had already had to go into buying up, rebalancing their equity weight.
Right.
So when he said sorry for deriding QE and calling it habit forming in a FOMC transcript, when he wanted to vote against QE3, but he didn't because he was so young, he didn't want to dissent on the board. He was such a rookie. But all he did on January the 4th was ignite that trade even further. And now stocks are triple from that point. But it wasn't the Powell pivot that was the initial catalyst. It was the rebalancing. So in theory, we could have a pretty bloody first quarter if the Fed's really going to race through this taper and start talking about rate hikes. But you could also have this massive rebalancing come March the 23rd, unless the structure of indexing begins to break under its own weight. And now remember, this is 90% of flows in the United States go into indexing or passive funds in some way, shape, or form, but they've become gargantuan. And they've never been tested by a Fed not willing to come to the rescue. So we will test Jay Powell's mettle in the coming months. If inflation persists into 2022 and he goes forward with rate hikes, despite the market coming down, then we may test the structure of passive investing. And that could be a game changer. No guarantee, but I tell you what, towards the end of the first quarter, if you start to see stocks race back and the Fed does nothing, you might see them bounce right back down. So, I mean, to be continued. We'll have to talk at the end of the first quarter again.
And on that, then, where do you feel it'll be? Do you think that they will bring up rate hikes? Do you think they'll go a little bit more, or do you think that they'll blink?
So, I mean, right now, China's sticking it to the United States. Let's be real. They're having a little bit more fun with this container shortage than they should. Okay, they produce 89% of the world's containers, and most of the containers happen to be in China. So I'm sorry, but I'm too old and cynical to believe in coincidence. So China's having a little bit of fun with these freight rates. And we've started to see them miraculously turn. And we've started to see the clogging at Long Beach and Los Angeles come off its highs. We've seen inventories build into gluts in certain parts of the industrial sector in the United States. Maybe not semiconductors specific to cars, but we've certainly seen inventories rebuild. So you could easily see, especially with the cooling that we're starting to see in the industrial sector in the United States, you could easily see that supply chain disruption narrative get disrupted itself in the first quarter. Is rent income going to come off its highs? I don't know. That's a much stickier form of inflation. Did paying Americans to not work and flirting with modern monetary theory and universal basic income with 3 stimulus checks and paying people to not work for way too long, will that keep wage inflation elevated? Perhaps that could happen. I mean, you're going to have to force people back into the workforce. And politics is economics. If Congress does not manage to pass some form of legislation by December the 31st, then the last source of post-pandemic cash stimulus to families is going to disappear. The child tax credit. The stimulus plans, they altered the way that was delivered. Instead of being given as a credit when you filed your taxes April 15th, by the April 15th deadline, families with children started to receive, this is about 90% of US families, by the way, started to receive on average $550 a month. And so they talk about the mystery of women in the United States workforce staying out of the workforce, not coming back. Well, maybe that $550 a month with school staying open and your ability to send your children back to school, maybe that $550 a month is enough of a supplement to keep the spouse outside of the workforce. Maybe because home prices are so high and because stock prices are near all-time highs. The 3+ million Americans who retired early, maybe they don't feel compelled to come back into the workforce. You're going to have to disrupt that balance in order to force people back into the workforce. It can happen, but there is a question of whether or not a lot of these jobs have been automated away. You have Flippy south of Chicago at a fast food chain that 24/7 flips French fries. His buddy behind him makes the excuse me, the hamburgers. There's a kiosk in the front that takes the order. So their automation has been extraordinarily accelerated. If you look at the composition of capital expenditures in the United States, it's being dominated right now by R&D, and IT. AI. These are companies that are saying, because margins are at the highest they've ever been. How are margins high if wage inflation's gone nuts? There's something in between the beginning and the end of that that doesn't make sense. There's a disconnect unless companies have been automating, unless a law library is now a big chunk of big data and you don't need a paralegal inside of a law office, but rather you can call up Mumbai and have somebody do your paralegal work for you halfway around the world. Because employees are now if there's one thing the pandemic taught employers, it's that they can have an employee anywhere. They don't have to deal with wage inflation in the United States and millennials who want to have experiential jobs to where they only have to come to the office 3 times a week. And I really don't want to work on Mondays or Fridays, by the way, but I promise I'll still be as productive as I would if I was in the office for 5 days. Oh, and by the way, I want more benefits and I want to be able to stay on social media 24/7. So maybe companies aren't liking the way that this flexible new employee is treating their profit margins. And maybe they're outsourcing and maybe they're investing a lot in automating. So if that's the case, another source of, and I'm writing about the extreme tail outcomes of 2022, another source of surprise could be the heat coming off wage inflation in 2022, because companies no longer need the same number of employees that they did before. Had we stayed on trend in the United States through the end of October, we would have created 7.8 million more jobs than there are today.
If you have,
so we're not just down what we lost, we're also down what we would have created.
well, you would have grown by, yeah. If you have that potential heat coming out of the wage inflation, and you've got an increase in automation as well, and then on top of that, you've also got other inflationary pressures sustaining into 2022 and beyond. That doesn't bode well for the wealth gap, particularly in the United States. Would you agree?
This is where the rubber meets the road, and there's been some excellent academic work that's been done in this area. Income inequality is economic. It's not only a social issue. And again, I think an overseas viewer would have a better appreciation for the damage that Donald Trump did to the country. And then the further damage that Joe Biden has done to the country subsequently too, when he's awake. So we've gone from being a country ripped apart at the seams to being a country ripped even further apart at the seams. And Mitch McConnell turns 80 in February. He doesn't want for his last term in the Senate to be as minority leader. He wants to go out with a gavel. And that's why he keeps stringing Chuck Schumer along, who is majority leader in the US Senate, saying, you go ahead and raise the debt ceiling on your own. Go ahead and do that on party lines. And then we can fire all the ad agencies and we can take more seats in the midterms in November of 2022 than the 61 that Obama lost in his first midterms. We can have the biggest bloodbath of all time. You want to see social unrest in this country? Wait until we get deep into the midterm election cycle. If inflation's not come off its highs. I mean, at least the people of France were liberated enough to storm the Banque de France and try and burn it down years ago during their protests. But with social media, I can tell you right now, especially with the people on my feed, they know that the Fed is the enemy within. And they know that the 1% have benefited. And they know after Donald Trump and then Joe Biden's attempt at imposing socialism in America, which is a failure, has made the country even more divided. And my hope is, on a positive note, that the middle rises. Extremes kind of dissipate in time, and that the midterm elections get rid of these extremists, because that's what we really do have. I mean, we have more extremism in America than even prior to 1969. You have to go back to the Civil War to find this divided of a country.
But is the middle's also getting a lot thinner? Would you agree? I mean, they're getting more polarized left and right, and leaving very few in the middle.
I'm gonna push back against that. The middle income earner's been decimated. The middle income earners, small businesses have been decimated. But I don't think there are as many Americans as it would appear in the media that are on the right or on the left. I think that that's why Pat Toomey, I go back to him, hashtag term limit Toomey. I think that that's why he's been so effectual. I mean, if there's, everybody always asks me, will you ever go into politics? And I say no, but I would launch a campaign to change the Constitution to impose term limits so that we had politicians that were forced to work for the populace. And that can be done with a vote in the middle. But no, The Economist recently ran a poll, and the percentage of American voters who identify themselves as independents has basically doubled over the past few years from 10% to 20%. 80% of independents identify themselves as being moderates. And I would argue to you that because there's been such pushback against socialism in America, because there are politicians like Joe Manchin who are straight down the middle, pure moderates, their voices are becoming the loudest voices. And I would argue that they represent the unheard voices of the majority of Americans who are in the middle and who don't want to go to war with each other and who don't watch MSNBC only or Newsmax only. But they're somewhere in the middle.
Put you on the spot for a second and put yourself in Jay Powell's chair. What would you do? What decision would you make and take?
It's, you know, he is damned. He's damned. If I was him, I would be damned. But you're going to think I'm a broken record. You're going to think that I have like Pat Toomey on my ceiling. In legislation that was passed on December the 27th, 2020, Donald Trump's last legislation that he signed into law, Pat Toomey imposed a rule that said that the Treasury Department, which would be Janet Yellen, in the event of a market disruption only, could not flip the facilities back on that bailed out the corporate bond market. Jay Powell knows that he bailed out the corporate bond market. He knows that since that day on March the 23rd, 2020, we've gone from 10 trillion to 11.5 trillion. Companies haven't cleaned up their balance sheets. Stock markets are more of a value than they've ever been. And he knows that those credit facilities cannot legally be turned on unless there's a separate, exigent, and unusual situation. He could let the zombies go. He could let the economy go into recession. He could be Paul Volcker. He could give the economy the bad medicine that it needs to get past the point of having to be on the constant drip of quantitative easing in order to get by. And he would succeed in putting the country in recession in a midterm year, because the politicking will be so rancorous that passing legislation to come in and save the day again, passing anything along those fiscal magnitude lines with the moderates in charge is not going to happen. So he could pull a Paul Volcker. And if I was Jay Powell, I would pull a Paul Volcker. I would let the zombie companies go. I would let the restructurings occur. I would let the biggest companies in America that are poor operators go. And I would kindly suggest to Congress that they dust off something called antitrust law in America to stop allowing the monopolies to get bigger and bigger and speak up for small businesses. That's what I would do if I was Jay Powell.
It's a perfectly honest answer.
I will say this much, whether we're in disinflationary times or in inflationary times, you look back through history, even I do believe disinflation is coming towards the second half of 2022. That doesn't mean I'm looking to sell my gold, bottom line, or my silver. So period end. Because times of disruption and inflationary times, gold is your best friend. Precious metals are your best friends. So
before we wrap up, maybe just tell us a little bit more about what it is that you do at Quill and how people can find out a little bit more about it.
Sure. So Quill Intelligence was founded when I left the Federal Reserve, and I basically do in my independent research firm what I did for President Richard Fisher when I was his advisor. So we publish 8 days a week, literally. And we're about to double our prices again when we come to our 4-year anniversary in late May. So right now is the time to jump in if you want to become one of our subscribers. And we also have an institutional level of subscription that's available for professional investors. That's called QI Pro, a whole different thing. But go to quillintelligence.com. And if you don't follow me on Twitter, I'm awake when you're awake overseas. So you can follow me at DiMartino Booth as well.
That's fantastic. And for now, thanks for joining us on GoldCore TV today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, you'll also enjoy these interviews that I've done with other industry experts. And remember, if you want to see more interviews with industry experts and thought leaders in financial markets, subscribe to GoldCore TV and hit the notification bell now. And if you want to learn more about how to buy, sell, and store physical gold and silver, log on to goldcore.com, your precious metals experts.